If a PE firm sat across from you today, what do you think they'd actually be buying? That's a question we're answering today on Edge-Ucation. Today, we're going to talk about positioning, and we're going to go through a couple of deals. And, as you look to, navigate, your exit path, thinking through the types of things you need to be looking out for. And today, we're going to be focusing mainly on positioning. So, to answer that question, what do you think PE firms are buying from you? Some owners may say revenue, some may say their team. Um, but we're going to talk a little bit more strategically about kind of the position that you have for your company, right, Christian?
Yeah, and we had 3 questions to kind of help you get into the mindset. And the 3 questions we have is, who specifically do you serve? What do you do better than anyone else? And how painful is it for your customers to leave you? So we're actually going to start with our first case study here. So as you see, we have 3 companies. We have Veritiv, we have Quaker Valley Foods, and USALCO. And each of these have a very interesting position. These are all purchases that have been happening, I want to say for the past 3 years. And they're all very interesting in their own regards because each one has a specific point to why they were actually purchased. Just to kind of give you a quick background on Veritiv. Veritiv was a publicly traded B2B distributor. They had $7.1 billion in revenue in 2023. They mainly did packaging, facility, and janitorial supplies, print products. They had national distribution networks absolutely everywhere, thousands of recurring business accounts, deep supplier relationships, and they were recently taken privately off the New York Stock Exchange. The second one is Quaker Valley Foods, which I'm sure you guys all know. It's a family-owned protein distributor. They have fresh frozen beef, pork, poultry, seafood, thousands of SKUs, which are scannable or scan keeping units. They serve independents and ethnic grocery retailers, a specific underserved customer that has a pretty big base that a lot of big distributors actually ignore. The last one is USALCO, which is a water treatment chemical business. They manufacture and distribute under one roof. The customers are municipal water authorities, commercial facilities. Demand is regulatory, non-discretionary. Water treatment is legally required. And as you can see with each of these, we have an estimate for each of the actual purchases. The first one being Veritiv, which was around 2.3 to 2.6 billion. Quaker Foods, unfortunately, we were not able to find exactly how much they got purchased for. We do know there was a $41 million real estate portion attached to that. And we got USALCO, which was $2 billion. So we'll go on to the first deal. You want to kick this off?
Yeah, sure. And before we get into the specific deals, let's just recalibrate or recap on positioning. So it's not necessarily, what who you're marketing towards or things of that nature, but it's also where you're situated within the overall market as far as what a financial buyer may be looking at. So it could be the types of customers you have. It could be a certain competitive advantage that you have within a fragmented market. It could be a geographic position as well, an actual physical position. But as we go through here, let's talk through Veritiv Corporation. So as Christian mentioned, janitorial supply company, they're, that's a fairly commoditized product. So, when CD&R is buying that company, they're not looking at this as some sort of specialized product. It's a, fairly available, type of product, janitorial supply, very fragmented market. Every city, every region has, local distributors that, handle that stuff as well. And then there's obviously national players as well in the case of Veritiv. But you're not necessarily buying it because of the product. It's a commodity. You can basically find those services anywhere. But if you look at the infrastructure that they have, a huge national network, deep supplier accounts, and recurring B2B accounts, these are fairly entrenched services, and that's when you look at facility maintenance and different types of janitorial supply, you're that's usually the last thing that a COO or somebody handling the budgeting is really looking to really change suppliers on. So it's a pretty sticky, despite it being a commodity, a fairly sticky service, just because it's not going to be a needle mover, in the state of maturity that it's in right now, right?
No.
So, but so with all of that, it also provides that position of just being a really appealing buyout option. So, when private equity buyers looks at them, they're seeing a fairly asset light purchase, relative to the scale that they operate in. We're talking, it's inventory and payables, receivables, a lot of working capital, but very asset light, not a lot of capital expenditure, high capex types of items on for that type of business.
Also, there's not really any specialized equipment usually with that stuff, which was kind of nice, at least within this example, which was, I think, made this help, or at least allow this transaction to go a little bit smoother. Because once again, as you said, they're really looking at this more from an infrastructure idea rather than the actual inventory itself and the receivables. Like, you're going for the actual accounts, the recurring items, so forth and so on. So this is not just based off of what products you may have or the specialty items that you need to create said items. This is really more about the surrounding infrastructure.
Yeah, and again, just the deeply entrenched nature. I imagine some of these accounts have probably might be decades old for the type of service they're providing, and those things aren't just going to be switched over to a new account. So, in the cases they do, I imagine there's a very low churn for something like that. So, very high dependable cash flows, which makes it a very nice target to apply some leverage onto it as part of the buyout. Enables you to buy at a premium too, just because you have the predictability and that the capital structure should work out fairly well. With potentially a significant amount of leverage. Just knowing that predictability of cash flows is coming in. That you are able to service that debt and get in at a lower equity price and be able to exit at a higher amount down the road. So particularly makes it interesting for a private equity buyer in that respect. But also, to follow up on that point, it also just makes it well positioned to also take on smaller competitors and bring it onto the platform.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, the main reason is that you look at CD&R, which for those who don't know is Clayton, Duwyer and Rice, which is the oldest, I think, PE firm that's been founded in New York for forever. But
I think it was 78. I think it was when it was founded.
They're primarily known for like a lot of operations heavy ownership, not just financial engineering. So when they buy a big stable business, they essentially try to improve how it's run, which is nice because this identifies exactly who your buyer is going to be. But also, Vertiv became their platform company. It allowed them to anchor, some bolt-on acquisitions through, maybe some smaller regional distributors, so forth and so on. But, once you buy scale once, you can then grow the moat around it.
Yeah, exactly. And when you buy it at that premium and you're kind of locking it into a certain multiple, you see this with a lot of very mature industries where you see a fragmented market. It's ripe for consolidation, especially in at that level of maturity from a fairly macro view, where you just this is the time where consolidation is going to start happening, just because this isn't an innovative industry, right?
No.
There might be some small changes to janitorial supply, but overall it's it's toilet paper, it's cleaning supplies, it's XYZ in that space. Nothing is really going to disrupt or change that type of market. So you have a lot of older players, so it's ripe for consolidation. And by having that infrastructure in place, you're able to go after those regional distributors, and you're ideally buying them at a smaller multiple than what you bought Vertiv at. But just by the sum, each time you make a type of acquisition like that, if you're buying it at an 8 multiple, but you bought Vertiv at a 16 multiple, let's say, that's immediately accretive to the overall value of the company. So that when it does look to exit, it makes it much more of an appealing Actually, just because that value is being complete, that you call it multiple arbitrage, but you're getting that value of that smaller regional business to now be worth the same as Veritiv, on a multiple level. And so you're immediately, accruing value on that. So if you have the enough capital to really, make that consolidation work, you're giving yourself a really solid exit for the private buyers. So,
Yeah, just to how this translate that kind of help you guys, why does a world-class PE firm pay for a premium? So once again, I think if I'm looking at my notes correctly here, I think they paid a 31% premium. But like, why does a world-class PE firm pay for a premium for cardboard boxes? And it's actually not the products, it's all about the infrastructure. So if you can create a good infrastructure for yourself that has a really stable, recurring revenue source, and you poise yourself to either become that large purchase or even that smaller regional, you can get a pretty nice multiple for it. It's really all about how the system is actually set up. Because once again, you look at CD&R, they're strictly there to improve the system. They're not there to fully fix or clean house, so to speak.
yeah. And, again, scaling it back down to your business, obviously, Veritiv's is a multi-billion transaction. This isn't, if you're listening to this podcast and you're, wondering why is this company, being brought up when I have an HVAC company that does, 5 million a year or, something under 10 million a year. How does that translate? Well, um, some of the fundamentals still apply. You may have a recurring customer base that is highly sticky as well, maybe B2B accounts, or just you have a customer base that, even if they're not, contractual revenue, might just be a very, very sticky customer base. But it's also something to keep in mind as you look for, with your ear to the ground, you may hear of, competitors or even, affiliated companies, maybe outside your region. You may have heard it, something, a competitor of yours got bought by a private equity buyer. That might be a hint to start doing your homework too. Is this, how are they positioned to be set up for the buyer? And is that something that I can, replicate or position myself, for that type of buyer too? Because a lot of times private equity buyers, they follow trends, so if one business is being bought, it's very likely that, if you're positioned properly, you might be next up as well. And, could be to that, company, that regional competitor of yours that was bought by that PE firm. That might be a potential to start a conversation. But if you look at, what they're investing in, that could give you some insight into, how you should position yourself as well. Because it gives you a little bit of a kind of a leading indicator of, is it because I'm in a fragmented market? Is it because, there's something strategic to, the location? Is there, um, you know, because, you may not necessarily be that platform company, but is there a larger company in your space that it is that potential platform company too? And can you position yourself to be a part of that, that bolt-on process as a private equity firm is looking to scale up and, build up their anchoring platform company?
Yeah, so just to go over this lesson again for Veritiv, do you have a B2B accounts that renew without being sold? So that once again, that is that sticky revenue that Stephen is talking about, which is so important and immediately makes you that much more attractive. Um, you know, the second one is your market fragmented? A lot of smaller regional competitors means someone is going to be the consolidator. That very much could be you, and that's what he was discussing as far as a competitor of yours may have gotten bought out. Um, are you a foundation or a one-off? So what we're asking there is, would your business be the Veritiv to what CDR is trying to do, and or are you just going to be the add-on or an additional revenue stream? And it's much better to be that platform and to strive to be that platform, because then it just attracts a larger buyer or a larger fish.
That's right. So as we go on, this one will be a little bit more of a um, with Quaker Valley Foods, a little bit of a smaller company, not a multi-billion-dollar deal. It's as Christian mentioned, it's a food distributor out of Philadelphia, and they have
Which you guys may know him. It's the guy with the Quaker on the around the circle, usually on a lot of products. But Yes, sorry, continue.
Well, it's Quaker Valley Foods, not Quaker Oats. So let's not get it
My
mixed
apologies.
up.
I was wrong.
But yeah, it is the Quaker state nonetheless, Pennsylvania. Um, so they so Quaker Valley Foods, they were bought by was it Hidden Harbor Capital
Yeah.
within the past couple of years, it looks like, and uh, they specialize in independent and ethnic grocery stores. So we're talking about a little bit more of a niche in the grocery space. So high volume. Again, potential, likely a sticky customer base. You're targeting, certain communities that want to go to that grocery store rather than the Krogers of the world or the Giant Eagles or so on and so forth to get their supplies. And a lot of times, they'll also be able those types of specialty grocery stores also will supply to restaurants as well that are specialized in that space.
Mhm.
So really good opportunity to hit it's a very large market, but in a very specialized service. And again, we talked about sticky relationships, but once you're a protein supplier or a specialty food supplier, it's very in a lot of cases, you may be the only one in that city that's providing that service to those specialized groups. So another way of just being completely, dominant within your specialty and your niche. And then, and that's just, and that demand is, you're going to go, these are typically high growth communities, and, it just adds to the, not just the recurring stickiness aspect, but also the opportunity for growth in that space as well. And obviously protein is increasingly in high demand as
Yeah.
well.
You got the Chipotle protein bowls.
Yeah, it's like every any type of fast casual spot, they're trying to up their protein offering. So, and that everything's downstream from that. So, America loves their protein, can't get enough. And so being in that protein distribution space is also very useful as well.
They got like protein chips. They got protein everything, protein drinks. I think some guy actually tried to create a protein water, but that would be a segment for another one. But just to kind of look at, Hidden Harbor, um, this is once again, I like to say, you got to know who would like to be an exit for you. So Hidden Harbor is a lower to middle market private equity group. They're really known to kind of do the quote unquote dirty work. They like to roll up their sleeves. They don't really write checks just to buy something, but they usually look for, founder or family owned businesses. And what they do is they like to professionalize them. So in this instance, what Stephen was kind of getting at is they're really buying the customer relationships. The independent ethnic grocery is an all-time high volume, very relationship driven, extremely loyal. So once you're the supplier, they don't switch. So the perishables and the SKU complexity, that's a natural barrier to entry. So this sticky customer base becomes, a really good foundation of a platform for geographical expansion. Family owned is often under professionalized. That's what the upside at PE scales. So when you hear family businesses, it's always great to have them, but you don't always think that they may be run at the highest quality, but we still love them.
Yeah, and as you mentioned, that complexity of the SKUs that they have, the SKUs, that type of complexity is a natural mode to the company. It's hard to uh, very hard to replicate that. When you're adding all these different product lines and service lines into your company. And again, it also just makes it as a nice platform as well, as we talked about with Veritiv. But when you have this type of complex organization, in terms of handling these different types of product lines, that also is part of your infrastructure component as well as too. So when you look at, again, other regional suppliers, knowing that you're properly built to be able to handle that complexity allows you to have the right you have the team in place, you have the organizational infrastructure and know-how of how to take on these future suppliers or distributors within this ethnic and protein independent supply chain space.
Yeah. I mean, they weren't the biggest food distributor, but they were the obvious choice for a customer nobody else was serving well. and the specialty is the position, as we like to say. So I guess we'll move on to the next one here. Oh, my apologies. I forgot we had some questions here. So once again, for your business, are you trying to serve everyone? So broad appeal usually equals, average margins. The most valuable position is we are the obvious choice for the specific customer. How hard is it for your best customer to leave you if switching costs are high? Operational complexity, relationships, reliability, you have a moat. And that's the moat that we were discussing. And is your business ready to be scaled? Family owned means less professionalized. And what we mean by less professionalized means that there are some systems that can be improved and there are some items that often can be overlooked within a family business. But that's often what PE buys, the position plus the upside of systemizing it. So once again, they're looking for something that has done very well. And there's a couple of things that they can add to it. But a thing that makes it a little bit more attractive is how hard or sticky are your customers and how important are they to you? So I guess we'll go to USAL Co. then. So once again, USAL Co. Probably not a whole lot of people have heard about them. It is a water treatment chemical business. Once again, they mainly serve municipality, water authorities, commercial facilities. So unless you're really specifically within that business, probably less heard of because not too often do a lot of people deal with commercial water treatment. But water treatment is legally required, which allows this to be a little bit more of an attractive business. So the buyer was TJC. TJC is, I believe, the Jordan company. They're a New York middle market PE firm. They have a long track record. I know they specifically do a lot in industrials and chemicals. This was actually I think a secondary sale, right, from HIG.
Yeah, that's what it appears. It's none of this is it's hard to get the full information, but it does look like it was a secondary buyout. So just further validation to the for this type of company. And as Christian mentioned, these are there's municipal and state level regulations, federal regulations. These types of industries, provide that type of regulatory moat, which those laws typically only go in one direction in terms of regulation. It's some stuff may get scaled back over administrations, but on the whole, it's there's always this increasing regulatory broadening and overreach. So that just makes some of these types of companies even much more difficult to crack into or disrupt. So if you're able to get into a company that has this type of protective moat on the regulatory side, it typically just allows you to help capture more and more market share and and get more value over the course of the holding period.
Yeah. So the main reason why TJC bought this was really what they call a mission critical demand. Municipal customers shop reliability, compliance, and trust. And if you've ever been within a municipal meeting, everything is obviously voted on. So you do have to have a pretty strong track record. Otherwise, you're kind of walking into a lion's den and you probably will never get that business. It is recession proof because we all need water. No matter how bad times get, we do need water. Regulatory driven revenue, and they have integrated manufacturing and distribution, which is extremely hard to replicate because once again, you're under such a fine microscope or such a fine tooth comb that you really have to be very cautious on who you are dealing with because, they're not going to hand these contracts out to anybody because it can be absolutely harmful to, the users of said water. But, essentially they were trying to buy a very defensible essential service platform with pricing power. Now, municipal water systems I could go on and on, and on about these, but a lot of times you'll have sometimes municipal systems actually selling their water and sewage systems to privately owned companies. And even then, they're still held under regulations that are followed by the state. So even if it is a privately owned, water system or a sewage system, they still have to obey by the regulatory rules set forth by them.
Right.
So once again, you're really having that kind of, I don't know how to describe it, but really that circle that you have to be within.
That's right. Yeah. And, to translate this down to, some smart company, we find this with, you know, companies that provide, road services as well. So like, let's say, you're, you have a, for like road construction and that sort of stuff, something at the more local level, that might be a smaller company that's kind of operating in that space where you have to have, um, certain types of crews in place. The people that make the signs even, is a very nice, market, those types of suppliers that, handle that type of, traffic and construction equipment. And even downstream from that, the, service company that's actually manning those crews as well is something you might be able to find at a, that could be a little bit more applicable to you if you're, in that smaller, scope, in the lower middle market scope. But those, companies, those types of companies also have, somewhat of a regulatory, mode as well, where, if you have a, could be, a highway contractor that you're the one providing the safety crews for, something like that. So, obviously, regulatory stuff is a little bit more of a, it's very specialized to, specific industries. That's just a one-off example, but even, even your, plumber and, those types of trades, there has to be, things that have to be up to code, things that, you may have had, over the course of, the business you had, and especially in terms of new building construction, there's always, more and more, regulations that come into play for,
Permits.
Different types of permits. So, if you have, that type of system in place where you have, the administrators that can, pull those permits, are keeping up to date with new regulations that come in that allow you to stay ahead of the curve as far as, that type of construction. That's something that could be a little bit more, applicable to you, or if you have that team set up to be able to, nimbly handle the permitting process, be abreast and, be on top of, new regulations and, permitting procedures that come in, that can help kind of protect you from, that plumber that just decides to, get his own truck and start, doing his own jobs where, you know, he may just be relegated to, just, fixing sinks at people's houses, whereas you're more set up to be able to handle new construction builds, more, um, you know, municipal buildings, commercial construction, that sort of stuff, where, it takes a little bit more expertise and there might be a little bit more complexity. Or again, with the second deal we discussed, allows you to take advantage of that market, relative to, other competitors in your space. So, um, you know, keeping it down level to where you might be if you're a, $5 to $10 million company, finding avenues where you can, set yourself apart in that respect as well. So, um, a couple of questions for that as well. So, we kind of touched on this, but if you have, regulations within your industry, how are you using that as an edge for your company, and and using that to just strengthen your positioning. Um, and another lesson, this is something we talk a lot about at SCG Edge as we talk to our clients. But if you were to stop operating tomorrow, how long would it take for things to break? So again, that's also about how good your customers are, and also how good your team is as far as
Your SOPs, your systems, so forth and so on. Like, for instance, in this question, who would stop operating if you disappeared tomorrow? For USALCO, it would be the water system, and nobody likes that to happen. But once again, you can't run. So whenever companies are looking for businesses to buy, they usually like to see if things can be operated without you. So if you wanted to ask yourself kind of a good question, which I'm going to expand upon what Steven said, we usually ask, what would happen if you were to leave your business just for a day? And then what would happen to it if you left for a week? What would happen if you left for 30 days? And if your answer increasingly goes south, meaning things are going to break, a lot of things are going to break, then usually that means that the business is highly dependent upon you, which is not really easy to do whenever you're looking to obtain another business because everything is so reliant upon you. So to go back to kind of Stephen here, it's all about your operations, your SOPs, and your team, making sure that everybody is set in place.
Right. And the flip side to that too is what happens to your customers if you stop operating as well. If you were to stop working, if if your customers or your best customers, if you went away tomorrow, like they could still call somebody else the next day and, figure it out. It may not be, 100% of the same, product or service you provide, but they can get 95% of the way there. But again, that's why regulation is kind of important too for some of these industries, is because 95% doesn't cut it. But even if it's, I know we're talking about regulation here, but even outside of that regulatory framework, if you have, a customer base that if you were to leave, regulations aside, would be in, a lot of trouble without you being able to provide that service or that product. It still kind of lends credence to that, stickiness of your customer base, and, potentially even an opportunity to, deepen that further. I don't want to get too far out of scope, but, other service lines, ways to embolden that customer relationship, or even, improve your pricing with them as well, as you look to, make sure that things are, more equitable. If you're a mission critical aspect to them, and, you're very hard to replace, that's something to also consider, is your pricing.
Yeah, that kind of leads us to our last question is, have you been through a major ownership or leadership change and kept your customers? Meaning, have you fired a GM, hired a GM, and, if your position survived the transition, then it's real. You got a good system. That's what the buyer usually looks to underwrite. So I guess we'll go on to, our last sort of couple segments, which is our framework, which is, to go back through, we brought these up for a reason. So the main one is, we like to look for recurring predictable cash flow, a customer who can't easily leave, platform potential, infrastructure that's hard to replicate. So for the first one, we like to see contracts, relationships, auto renewals, not project work, meaning you're not doing one job at a time and you're really waiting for that next project. We'd like to see some sort of outside income coming in, which is, to go back to that, I believe was the Veritiva. And then a customer who can't easily leave, switching costs is the moat. The harder to leave, the more defensible the position. That's what we went over with the Quaker Valley Foods, which is obviously the ethnic and independent buyers that they like to have within the complex systems. And then platform potential, a foundation other companies can be bolted onto. Scale matters more than size. So that was also the CDR example as well. And then infrastructure that's hard to replicate. That's what we were talking about with a lot of the, actually just the previous example. So supply chain depth, supplier relationships, market presence built over years, not months. This really matters a lot too. And I think this is actually a pretty good starting for us as well for this, at least the Edge-Ucation podcast, which, by the way, are our two producers we're so happy to name Edge-Ucation. Get it? Because we're SEG Edge.
Yeah. So, key takeaway, as we talk about your customers and how you're positioned to a potential buyer, keep this in mind. As we had mentioned, how long would it take for your best customer to replace you if you were to leave tomorrow or disappear? So, 1 week as a commodity, 6 months decent position, 1 year plus private equity buys. Now, this obviously isn't set in stone. We mentioned Veritiv is a commodity that business, but they have that complexity of their operations. They have that national scale.
You got the systems and the infrastructure
that makes it a little bit more difficult to do. But but for your key place, especially as you're operating in a likely a lower middle market space, if you're listening to our podcast, these questions will matter, a lot more. Where even if you may even just think you're a commodity, but that's also why we're talking about positioning is, um, can you take, you know, can you add complexity to your business that makes it harder to replicate? Not um, in a haphazard way, but doing it because it's getting you to a more specialized space where you're able to command, a premium for your service, that sort of thing that makes it a little bit more difficult for your customers to switch. So, or if your customers are just, so, sticky to you that they, wouldn't want to leave, there's a lot of different ways to interpret, this type of thing where even if you're commodity service, you may still be, fairly entrenched with your customers that it actually, when you actually look at it, it's a little bit more specialized than you may think on first glance.
Yeah, absolutely. And then, guess some closing thoughts are, you want to run this test on every customer relationship you have. We have our 3 deals or 1 lesson. Build the position, the money will then follow, if that makes sense. But we'd like to thank you guys for tuning in and listening in. Once again, I am Christian and this is Steven, and we have officially concluded our first podcast of Edge-Ucation.
Yeah.